The man at the corner booth hadn't touched his coffee. That was the first thing Merle Adkins noticed when she came on shift at 7:30. The cup was still full, still steaming faintly, and the man sitting behind it was looking out the window at the parking lot like he was reading something written in the asphalt. Merle had been waitressing at the Pineview Family Restaurant in Caldwell, Georgia for 19 years. She knew the difference between a man who hadn't touched his coffee because he forgot it was there, and a man who hadn't touched his coffee because something was wrong. This man knew the coffee was there. He just had other things on his mind. His name was Arthur Beaumont. He was 53 years old, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the kind of hands that had done real work in their time, wide palms, knuckles that had known cold mornings and long hours. He was wearing a plain dark jacket over a collared shirt, no tie. A leather bag sat on the seat beside him. He had driven 4 hours from Atlanta, left before sunrise, and stopped at Pineview because the GPS had suggested it and because he hadn't eaten since the night before. And because sometimes a man just needs to sit somewhere quiet before walking into the thing he's been dreading. He ordered the breakfast special, 2 eggs over easy, bacon, wheat toast, orange juice. He said please and thank you, and he left the menu squared neatly on the edge of the table the way people do when they've been raised to think about the person who has to pick it up. Merle brought him his juice and told him the food would be about 10 minutes, and he smiled at her, a small, tired smile, and said that was just fine. It was a Tuesday. The restaurant was maybe a third full. There were 2 men in work boots at the counter, talking low over their plates. There was a family in the booth nearest the door. A mother, a grandmother, 2 kids under 10 who were negotiating loudly over a shared order of pancakes. There was a retired schoolteacher named Paulette Greer, who came in every Tuesday and Thursday, and always ordered the same thing and always rested the same section of the paper. And she was doing that now, folded neatly, glasses on, unbothered by the world. Nobody was paying Arthur Beaumont any particular attention. That changed when Dale Whitmore walked in. Dale Whitmore was the chief of police of Caldwell. He had been the chief of police of Caldwell for 11 years, which was long enough that he had started to believe the job and the man were the same thing. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with a thick neck and a jaw that looked like it had been quarried from somewhere. He walked like a person who had not been questioned in a very long time. He came in alone, which was unusual. He usually came with a deputy or stopped to talk with half the restaurant on his way to his usual stool at the counter. Today he came through the door, let it swing behind him, and his eyes moved across the room the way they always did. Fast, assessing, proprietary. This was his town. He looked at it like a man checking inventory. His eyes landed on Arthur Beaumont. They stayed there a second longer than they landed on anything else. Whitmore walked to the counter, said something to Merle's co-worker, Patsy, and accepted a cup of coffee. He didn't sit down. He stood with one hand flat on the counter and drank his coffee slowly and looked at the parking lot, or appeared to. Anyone paying attention would have noticed that his eyes kept returning to the corner booth. Arthur Beaumont was still looking out the window. He had not looked at Whitmore. He did not seem aware that anything had shifted. Patsy brought his food. He thanked her. He ate quietly, methodically, the way tired men eat when they're fueling themselves rather than enjoying themselves. He cut his toast into thirds. He kept his napkin in his lap. He was the kind of man, Merle would later think, who had never stopped being careful about the small things. As if the small things still mattered in places where the big things had already been decided against you. Whitmore set down his cup. He pushed off from the counter. He walked toward the corner booth. Merle saw it happen and felt something tighten in her stomach. A feeling she couldn't have fully named, only that it was familiar, the kind of feeling you get in a restaurant when something is about to go wrong and you're holding a pot of hot coffee and you're not sure where to put yourself. Whitmore stopped at the edge of Arthur Beaumont's table. He stood there for a moment, not speaking, just standing, and then he said, the way a man says something when he wants the words to land with the full weight of his office behind them. Don't think I've seen you in here before. Arthur Beaumont looked up. His face was calm, not the calm of a man who hadn't noticed the tone. The calm of a man who had heard that tone before and had learned, over 53 years, exactly what to do with it. Just passing through, Beaumont said. Passing through. Whitmore said it back, not as a question, more like he was testing the phrase for structural integrity. Passing through to where exactly? Make it. Another echo. Another pause. You got family in Macon? Business. Whitmore pulled out the chair across from Beaumont without asking and sat down in it. He set his forearms on the table and leaned in just slightly and said, "What kind of business?" The restaurant had not gone quiet. Not yet. The kids were still negotiating the pancakes. Paulette Greer was still reading her paper. The men at the counter were still talking. But something had changed anyway. Such frequency in the air had shifted, and the people who were tuned to that frequency had felt it, even if they didn't look up. Legal business, Beaumont said. And then, because he was a careful man who had been raised in a world that punished black men for ambiguity, he said, "I'm an attorney." Something moved across Whitmore's face, not quite a flinch, more like a recalibration. "Is that right?" he said. "It is. You got ID on you?" The question landed in the space between them like something dropped on a hard floor. There was no reason for it. No violation, no disturbance, no cause at all beyond the fact that a black man in a jacket and a collared shirt was eating eggs over easy in a restaurant that Whitmore had decided some years ago belonged to him. Beaumont did not answer immediately. He picked up his orange juice, drank from it, set it back down. He was buying himself a moment not out of fear but out of discipline, the kind that comes from knowing what happens when black men let their first reaction be their only reaction. "Why?" Beaumont said. "Because I'm asking. You're asking a man who's eating breakfast for his ID. I'm asking a man I don't recognize, in a town where I know most people, for his ID." Whitmore leaned back slightly. "We've had some trouble lately. Break-ins. Just being thorough." It was a lie, and everyone at the counter who had been listening, and Merle had started listening the moment Whitmore sat down, could hear that it was a lie. There had been no particular trouble. There had been nothing except a black man sitting in a corner booth eating eggs. Beaumont looked at Whitmore for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, took out his wallet, and produced his driver's license. He held it out flat, held it the way people hand over something that doesn't belong to the person asking for it. Whitmore took it. He held it at arm's length, tilted it toward the light. He read from it, not loudly, but loud enough, "Arthur James Beaumont." He looked up. "Long way from home." "Oh, 4 hours," Beaumont said. "I left early." Whitmore turned the license over. Looked at the back, though there was nothing particularly interesting on the back of a Georgia driver's license. Then he set it down on the table rather than handing it back. A small thing, a deliberate small thing. "You said you're an attorney?" "I did. What kind of law?" "Civil rights," Beaumont said. The word civil landed first. Then rights followed it a half-beat later. Whitmore's jaw moved slightly, the way a jaw moves when a man is deciding what expression to wear. "Civil rights attorney, passing through Caldwell, Georgia." Whitmore picked up the license again. "Heading to Macon, that's correct. Lot of civil rights problems in Macon these days?" "There are civil rights problems everywhere these days," Beaumont said. "That's why I stay busy." It was the most he'd said since Whitmore sat down, and it was not aggressive, not hostile, just accurate, delivered in a voice that was trained to make arguments in rooms full of people who did not want to hear them. Beaumont had argued before federal judges. He had stood in courtrooms where the air itself felt hostile, and had opened his mouth and spoken clearly, and he had won more often than people who looked at him from across restaurant tables would have expected. That history was not visible. It never was. That was the point. Whitmore set the license down again. He turned slightly on his seat and signaled to Patsy, held up his cup for a refill, normalizing, settling in, sending a message that he was in no particular hurry. Patsy came over with the coffee pot, and her eyes met Merle's across the restaurant, and there was a full conversation in that look, the kind that women who have worked together for years can have without making a sound. The kids had stopped arguing about the pancakes. The mother had noticed something, some change in the room's atmosphere, and had quietly gathered her children's attention toward their plates. Paulette Greer had folded her paper. She had not put it away. She had folded it and set it on the table, and she was watching now, openly, in the way that women of a certain age and a certain backbone sometimes do when they've lived long enough to know what they're looking at. Whitmore drank his refilled coffee and then reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small black notebook. He opened it, clicked a pen. "I'm going to need your vehicle information," he said. "Just routine, part of what I mentioned." "The break-ins," Beaumont said. "That's right." Beaumont said nothing. He looked at the notebook, at the pen, at Whitmore's hand holding the pen, and then he said quietly, "Chief, I've been sitting in this restaurant for 20 minutes. I have not disturbed anyone. I've not behaved in any manner that would give you cause to question me, request my ID, or document my vehicle information." He paused. "You and I both know that." The room was quiet now. The men at the counter were quiet. The family was quiet. Paulette Greer was very still. Whitmore's face did something complicated. The expression that came out the other side of it was the one he'd been wearing for 11 years. The one that said, "In this town, in this room, I decide what's cause and what isn't. Why don't you step outside with me?" Whitmore said. It was not phrased as a question. "No," Beaumont said. The word sat there. "Excuse me?" Whitmore said. "I won't step outside. I'm finishing my breakfast. If you believe you have lawful grounds to detain me, you're welcome to state them." Something shifted in Whitmore's posture, a rigidity that moved from his shoulders down through his spine. 11 years of being the loudest authority in Caldwell, Georgia, and here was a man in a dark jacket who would not move. "You're being uncooperative," Whitmore said. "I'm being legal," Beaumont said. Whitmore stood up. He drew himself up to his full height, which was considerable, and he looked down at Arthur Beaumont the way he had looked down at men before when the looking had been enough. "I'm going to ask you one more time. And I'm going to give you the same answer," Beaumont said, "because that answer is correct." What happened next, Merle would describe later to her sister on the phone as the moment when it stopped being about breakfast. Whitmore reached to his belt, not for anything that would cause the heart to stop, but for the handcuffs clipped there, and the sight of them, the casual ease with which he unclipped them and set them on the table between himself and Arthur Beaumont like a negotiating chip, was enough to make the mother across the room quietly put her arm around her daughter. "I'm taking you in for questioning," Whitmore said. "Suspicion of what?" Beaumont said. Not loudly, evenly. Like a man who had cross-examined people for 26 years and knew how to make a question feel like a wall. Whitmore said something about loitering, about behavior consistent with casing a location, about needing to verify his story, and every word was thin as paper, and everyone in the room could see through it, and nobody said anything. Nobody except Paulette Greer. Paulette Greer was 71 years old. She had taught high school English in Caldwell for 34 years. She had been in this restaurant every Tuesday and Thursday for 11 years, which meant she had been sitting in this restaurant under Dale Whitmore's tenure as chief of police for 11 years, and she had watched things, and she had noted things, and she had said nothing, because she had told herself it was not her place, and because it was easier to read the paper and drink the coffee and let the world be what it was going to be. She picked up her coffee cup. She set it back down. She said loudly enough that it reached every corner of the room, "Dale, this is not right, and you know it." Whitmore turned. He looked at Paulette Greer with an expression that contained, mostly, surprise. Surprise that she had spoken, surprise that her voice had filled the room that way, surprise that 71 years of noting things had turned into a sentence. "Paulette, I'd appreciate it if you'd stay out of." "I've been sitting in that chair," Paulette Greer said, pointing at her regular chair, "for 11 years. I've been staying out of things for 11 years. She looked at him steadily. "I'm done staying out of it." One of the men at the counter, a man named Skip who did HVAC repair and had never in his adult life wanted to be in the middle of anything, turned around on his stool and said, not loudly, not heroically, just honestly, "She's right, Dale." The other man at the counter said nothing, but he also turned around, and his turning around said something. Whitmore stood there in the middle of his town, in the middle of the restaurant that was supposed to be his, and the room looked back at him, and it was not the room he thought it was. He looked down at Arthur Beaumont. He picked up the handcuffs, and he put them on Arthur Beaumont's wrists. Later, people would debate whether he did it because he couldn't back down or because he had already committed and saw no exit. What was not debated by anyone who was in that room was what happened 40 seconds later. Arthur Beaumont's leather bag had shifted when his hands were cuffed, slipping partly off the bench seat, and the flap fell open, and a lanyard spilled out, the kind that holds a credential badge, the kind with a photograph and a seal, and a set of words printed clearly beneath the image. Patsy saw it first. She was standing closest, coffee pot still in hand. Her face did something that faces do when the mind cannot immediately process what the eyes are delivering. She looked at it. She looked up at Whitmore. She looked back down at it. And then, without meaning to, Without any decision involved at all, she took a step backward, and her elbow caught the edge of the serving counter, and the coffee pot tilted. And 3 coffee cups that had been sitting there went off the edge and hit the tile floor and shattered. And the sound of them was like a punctuation mark. The badge was from the United States Department of Justice. Arthur Beaumont was not merely an attorney. Arthur Beaumont was a senior civil rights investigator for the United States Department of Justice, and he was on his way to Macon, Georgia, as part of an active federal investigation into civil rights violations in Deering County, a county that sat 40 miles east of Caldwell, a county that Whitmore's brother-in-law was sheriff of, a county that had been the subject of complaints that had been climbing, slowly and quietly, up through channels that eventually reached offices in Atlanta and then offices in Washington, until they reached the desk of a man named Arthur James Beaumont, who had driven 4 hours in the dark and stopped for breakfast and ordered eggs over easy, and asked for wheat toast, and said please and thank you, and had not at any point done a single thing wrong. The room understood all of this in the space of about 4 seconds, the way rooms do when a single image rearranges everything. Whitmore stood very still. The handcuffs were still on Arthur Beaumont's wrists. Beaumont looked up at Whitmore. His expression had not changed, not triumph, not anger, not satisfaction, just that same steady, careful stillness that he had brought into the restaurant with him at 7:30, the stillness of a man who had learned that composure, maintained long enough, has its own kind of power. The key, Beaumont said, would be appreciated. Whitmore uncuffed him. His hands were not steady, and the key took longer than it should have. When the cuffs were off, Beaumont rolled his wrists once, picked up his badge lanyard, and tucked it back into his bag. He picked up his fork and finished the last of his eggs. He drank his orange juice. He folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. He looked at Paulette Greer across the restaurant. She was still watching him, still with her coffee in front of her, and something passed between them. Not a smile exactly, but a recognition. She had taught 34 years of students to stand up in the moment when standing up counted. Today, she had done it herself. "Thank you," Beaumont said to her. "You don't need to thank me," Paulette Greer said. "I should have spoken sooner." Beaumont reached for his jacket and took out a business card and left it on the table next to his plate. He put on his jacket. He picked up his bag. He stood up and looked at Dale Whitmore, who had not moved from where he stood and who had become, in the last 4 minutes, a smaller man than he had been when he walked in. "I'll be in contact," Beaumont said, professionally. He walked to the register. He paid for his breakfast. He left a 20% tip. He walked out through the door of the Pineview family restaurant into the Georgia morning, got into his car, and continued south toward Macon. Inside the restaurant, nobody spoke for a moment. Then one of the kids, the younger one, who had understood almost nothing of what had just occurred but had understood that it mattered, looked up at her mother and said, in a loud whisper, "Is the man okay?" The mother pulled her daughter close. "Yes, baby," she said. "He's okay." Merle stood behind the counter with her hand on the coffee pot and looked at the door where Arthur Beaumont had walked out and thought about the small, tired smile he had given her when she said the food would be 10 minutes. The smile that said that's just fine, the smile that had in it, now that she understood it, a whole lifetime of knowing that the world was going to make him wait, and being ready for it anyway, and showing up anyway, and sitting down at the table anyway, and ordering his eggs and saying please and being simply exactly what he was, every single day, in every room that tried to tell him he was something less. Dale Whitmore left without finishing his second cup of coffee. Nobody watched him go. That afternoon, the owner of the Pineview family restaurant, a man named Gerald Adcox, who had run the place for 22 years and who had watched the morning's events unfold from behind the kitchen window, made 3 phone calls. The first was to his insurance agent. The second was to his daughter, because he needed to tell someone what he had seen. The third was to a reporter at the county paper, because Gerald Adcox had grown up in Caldwell, and he was 68 years old, and he had been waiting his whole life for a Tuesday where something true finally happened, out in the open where everyone could see it. 3 weeks later, the investigation that had begun long before Arthur Beaumont ever sat down in a corner booth became a matter of public record. The details that came out had nothing to do with the restaurant, and everything to do with the county 40 miles east, and the things that had been allowed to happen there for a long time by men who had never expected to be looked at closely. But people in Caldwell would tell the story of the Tuesday morning for years after that. The eggs, the badge, the coffee cups on the floor, the retired schoolteacher who finally said what she'd been keeping to herself for 11 years. They would tell it the way people tell the stories that remind them what they actually believe, underneath everything else. Arthur Beaumont drove into Macon at 11:20 and did the work he had come to do. He was very good at it.